Well, hey there team, welcome back to the channel and welcome to my overview of Skydance's Behemoth. So I've been sitting on this for a couple of days, it kind of dropped on me at last second. Ordinarily I'd have a spiel when it comes to overviews because I just give a game a 2-hour sort of go. But in light of recent chat on the channel, I actually flirted with the idea of reviewing this. I've got 9 hours clocked up. I would probably say I'm somewhere between 3/4 to 4/5 through the game. So this probably sits a little bit closer to review. However, I'm a bit fed up with this game as well, and I'm not really interested in punching through the last, I think probably 3 hours. If I had to guess, it's probably going to be a 12-hour game. So it's not all super high praise coming from me. So bear with me, we'll have a little bit of a chat. I'll explore a few of my thoughts on the game. But generally speaking, it seems like a pretty noble effort at doing what's printed on the box, which is to say bring a kind of AAA experience into VR. However, we've seen a couple of these attempts recently. Again, I'm a fair weather VR fan. I don't really cover all the, Fruit Ninja, Beat Saber sort of stuff, but these more high-profile releases do interest me as it's sort of starting to blur the line with mainstream gaming. And recently we looked at both Metro Awakening and Batman Arkham Shadow, who I would argue are doing the same thing. Their take on let's give AAA VR an earnest go. Whatever that is, let's start trying to do it. And I would also say that I reckon both those games did a better job at it than this did. So it's not a broad condemnation. There's some interesting gimmicks in here. I feel like they've set themselves up to really kind of shit the bed when they go public, being that this is supposed to be Shadow of the Colossus in VR. That's not really what it is. Like, I try and avoid spoilers, but in the case of kind of disclosure, inform the buyer, that sort of thing, the Behemoth I'm on, narratively, is the final one, and it's the third one. And from what I understand, again, I'm not going to go on spoilers beyond just number stating. I think there's a fourth hidden one, or like as a twist, but I don't know for sure. But the stories telegraph that pretty heavily. And I would say 95% of this game is not Behemoth fighting. The Behemoths are kind of spectacle and gimmicky. The first one was an absolute mess and required some sort of positioning that wasn't working. How to describe? You have to yank it with like your zipline thing and pull it into an environmental object. That's probably the best way to put it. But you're at the mercy of the positioning of the creature. And that many times I'm trying to get it, hey, come over here, walk over here. And it would just like stand still, bug out, glitch out, that sort of thing. So I don't know what to tell you. It was a real mess. It was very deflating. Like the spectacle and the epic, like I'm looking up at my ceiling, looking up at these things was really cool. And I will say the second Behemoth, spectacle-wise, very cool, very interesting. But mechanically in execution, kind of a mess. It is a very much a case of the developers asked if they could do it and then not so much if they should do it. In fact, execution across the board leaves a lot to be desired. Again, I'm not a hardcore VR super duper dude, right? So maybe I'm not up to speed with its contemporaries, like Blade and Sorcery I barely touched, it never ended up on the channel. But as a design principle, it really does feel kind of back to front and anti-fun. I've talked about this concept before of where a developer will build a game around the idea of what the character is at the end, with all your upgrades and abilities, etc. And then they will pull pieces out of it, and that's how they develop the game through. And you can tell usually in that case that it's not a very good game. You're playing not as an interesting character balanced in Act 1, you're playing as a character that has had all its interesting parts taken out of it to make it depowered in the earlier story. And that's really how it feels like it was designed here, because the other way, a good game design would be, from the very beginning, maybe you don't have double jump or whatever, you've hobbled ability-wise, and yet the levels and everything are built out in such a way that it feels fun anyway. Like in that moment, you think, I could play as this character the whole time, and it's kind of a pleasant surprise when you start to get upgrades. And again, it feels back to front. And the anti-fun philosophy comes from, well, look, I would say the rest of the other, 95% of the game that's not Behemoth fighting is kind of an even split between these little arena fights and platforming, rudimentary platforming. Or rather, I should say, between the platforming, there is like swing puzzles. You've got your zip line, you're swinging, and they're just kind of miserable, to be honest. The easiest way to deal with them seem to be cheesing them. Like, the game clearly wants you to hook from sort of monkey bar to monkey bar and swing like Tarzan, but if you just reel straight into the origin point, you kind of launch yourself off the top of that, and you, in a way, it's very hard to describe, but you're kind of going over the puzzle as opposed to swinging under it. And it's much better for your stomach as well. I think even iron stomach people are going to get potentially sick on this, especially on the second Behemoth, that's for sure. There are these sort of like box puzzles that come up, these little arenas where it'll be like drag a box around, put it on a button, manipulate it potentially with cranes and that, which is cool, actually. Like, it's really, really basic. And again, I'm not super in vogue with VR standards of puzzling, so I don't know if it's simple compared to its contemporaries. Who can say? But at the same time, I'm aware, here's a long stretch, a game that I don't think I even put on the channel, The Last Clockwinder, and I don't want to go into it too much, but in that you essentially spawn little clones of yourself imitating your motion, and you would, essentially run construction line, not machines, but like moving balls along, juggling it from one clone to the other. My point is, there's some really interesting puzzling that you can do in VR, and I don't want to necessarily judge this game for not being that game, but my point is, when the depth of the puzzles are drag a box onto a button, maybe shoot to open a door, it does seem pretty basic and not really taking advantage of what you could do with VR. But then, of course, we come to the combat arenas. And again, the gimmick, because this is kind of new to me, was pretty cool, but the shine worn off pretty quickly when I realized that there was this sort of, again, like I said, an anti-fun escalation to a lot of the design. Let me give you examples. In the very early stages, you're going to have kind of unhelmeted enemies. I don't know how else to describe it. Unarmored, right? And then you figure out you can throw daggers, you can sort of stab dudes in the face, that sort of thing, and it's pretty grisly and pretty awesome. And I think a lot closer to the more sword and board type games on this space. I believe Blade and Sorcery is the prolific one. But then quite quickly it starts to ramp and it becomes less physics-based, which again, that's a whole other thing as well, because the game kind of demands a precision. You've got like parry systems and your swings and your impacts, and it sort of starts cheating because now I'm starting to hit dudes in the head like hard, but they're not dying. They're like taking health damage. So it starts to get into, well, are we an RPG now or are we physics-based? To compare it to flat screen contemporaries, if you shoot someone in the head in a bloody Call of Duty or whatever, they fucking die. There's no question about it. The bullet goes in the head and it's the end of it. It's kind of systems physics-based. Well, you know what I mean, at least, right? There is a rule set to it. Whereas if you get into more RPGs, your Borderlands and all that, where you can shoot a dude 200 times in the head, that's understood. That's how that game works. It's more of an RPG health bar system. So this sort of presents itself as physics-based, right? As in, the enemy will dodge your abilities, you can dodge theirs, and infuriatingly, they will like reverse out just outside of your arm's reach. You would think that the game would, in a way, cheat in your favor because it should be a fun simulator to where when you duel with an enemy and you swing, you're not going to fall short. But the enemy seems to know what weapon you're holding and then adequately adjust their distancing from you. So you're never really in a sort of static position. You're always having to push the enemy back into a corner, or inversely, they push you into a corner. So this weird positioning interplay at the idle state animation for the AI is actually just unpleasant as anything. But I don't want to get away from my point. I've started hitting dudes in the head and they're not dying from it. They'll have a giant bloody gash, but they're still going. They have some sort of health bar, which kind of busts the bubble. Then you get to a point where they start wearing armor and helmets, and in order to get them off, you either have to use your little hook line to pull the helmet off, or you have to wail on it, preferably with like maybe an axe or something like that, to try and crack the armor, and then they start escalating the armor that they're wearing. Now the archers are wearing armor, so you can't really have a straight archer fight with them without using your special strength ability. You've kind of got this one-shot overcharge ability that is on cooldown every 10 seconds, and that's sort of an I win button, so you can use that to yank people's armor off or to shoot through it potentially, or swipe through it, cut dudes in half if they're unarmored. But then even after that, they start sending out these sort of like Templar dudes with even more jacked armor, which becomes kind of heavy attack proof in a way. And so it's just... It's a form of bullet sponging that I've never really seen, because bullet sponging would be in something like a Borderlands game, right? Whereas this game, it's pretty clear. On one hand, it kind of wants to tout itself as something that you can cut arms and legs and heads off. But on the other hand, it's doing everything it can every hour or so to increment that up and prevent you from using the tools that it purports to have fun. And then, like, on top of that, you might think, oh, well, this is sort of like a weapons sandpit simulator. Not really. Most of the weapons are kind of crap to use. You get these kind of core 3 weapons through the course of the game, maybe more later on, but I'm pretty sure it's the 3, that you can upgrade with some collectibles. And again, the exponential ramp on the upgrade's not great. The upgrades are pretty crap, and it gets to a point where you're picking up 1 or 2 of these things per area, and then it's demanding 40 to upgrade, and it's a bit weak. The way that you slot weapons into your hips and your shoulders is pretty, and it waits till about like 4 hours in to tell you, oh, you can hold a button to have different slots on your shoulders and that. And it's like, well, I probably could have used that information earlier. And then there's like a movement acceleration built into the weapon swing as well. So the heavier weapons are the most... Now, this might just be a medieval weapon VR thing. I don't know if I'm being critical to this game specifically or to the genre, but it became miserable to the point where, honestly, the only weapons you ever want to use are the sword, pretty much, that you have permanently, because if you drop it, it will teleport back into one of your slots. The bow's the same, and then you get an axe as well. But even then, the axe is pretty unpleasant to unwield because it has that slight acceleration problem to try and emulate like a lumbering swing, and instead it's just unpleasant. Anyway, look, I've been pretty hard on the game, and honestly, that's probably a big part of it, is because it's worn me out. There is something interesting in here. It is quite ambitious. I really do wonder how it's going to go in the eyes of my contemporaries, as it were, because I'm not a VR channel. Again, very fair weather. And I'm not trying to throw shade at VR channels, but I do find them to be kind of overly enthusiastic about everything. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm all for being passionate about your hobby, but I don't really see a lot of VR channels ever being critical of anything, really. Like, they're a different kind of breed. That's cool, that's fine. Everyone wants more happiness in their life, but I feel like I might be the only bloke that's out there saying these negatives against this game. And the list goes on and on. From what I understand, because I'm playing the PC VR build, and I saw the Steam discussions and the listing on Steam, and they've been comms quiet. Now, the press release that they gave me was to say that this is the current version. The other versions, the MetaQuest, the PSVR 2, are apparently a bit older, like month-old builds, and they won't be updated till day one patches. So who even knows I don't understand what's going on, why they were so quiet, and it sounds like our builds might even be different as well. Anyway, look, again, it's kind of turned into a review. I'll still call it an overview, but yeah, I would tread carefully. This is not going to be a system seller. Like, if you are thinking about getting VR for this, don't do that. Get it for Arkham Shadow. That's what I would say. That's much better. Anyway, there's probably more I could go on about. I took notes and all that. Again, I was gearing up to review, but this video's already gone on long enough. Let's just put it up as is. But suffice to say, I'd be very, very careful getting into this game. Not to say that I had a wholly unpleasant time. I did keep coming back into it, even with horrible checkpointing systems that would wipe, 20 minutes of progress, particularly difficult arenas. Anyway, I'll stop waffling because it's turning into a bash session, and that's not really what I'm interested in. Buyer beware. Be very careful going into this. Anyway, team, might just leave it there for the time being, and I'll catch you guys on the next one.